The slipspace portal hadn't opened so much as screamed. That was the only word Cortana had managed to transmit through the static before the Forward Unto Dawn's aft section, already held together by battle damage and desperate prayer, simply ceased to exist around him. One moment, John 117 was braced against a bulkhead, watching the azure tunnel of the emergency slipspace jump collapse inward like a dying star. The next, there was nothing. Not darkness, not void, nothing. The specific, nauseating absence of reality itself that no human being was ever meant to experience and survive. He survived it anyway. He always did. John hit the surface of something solid at a velocity that would have liquefied an unaugmented human being. The impact registered across his HUD as a cascade of amber warnings, shield integrity dropping to 63% before the recharge cycle stuttered, climbed, stuttered again, and settled at an agonizing crawl. He was on one knee before the dust cloud finished rising, MA-40 assault rifle up, visor scanning. What he saw stopped even a Spartan cold. He had fought on glassed planets. He had walked the broken rings of Halo installations and stood inside Forerunner megastructures that dwarfed solar systems. He had seen the flood reduce thriving civilizations to biomass in 72 hours. He thought he understood scale. The 41st millennium corrected that assumption immediately. The sky was wrong. Not alien wrong. He'd seen 100 alien skies, but fundamentally, cosmically wrong. It churned with colors that had no business existing in visible light. Aurora-like veins of violet and arterial red threading through clouds that moved against the wind. Two moons hung at angles that suggested the planet's gravity was being negotiated rather than enforced. In the far distance, a spire rose from a ruined city, Gothic, immense, crowned with an aquila so massive it blotted the horizon. Gargoyles the size of scorpion tanks lined its buttresses. Bells rang from somewhere inside it, a sound less heard than felt in the back teeth. The air smelled like incense, blood, and ozone, like a cathedral after a battle. John, Cortana's voice crackled through the neural interface, fragmented, stripped of her usual clarity, but present. That mattered more than he could articulate. I'm partial. Something happened to the slipspace matrix. I'm running on your armor's local memory. No projection capability, limited processing. But I'm here. Situation assessment, he said quietly, still scanning. Working on it. The star overhead is consistent with an M-class, but the radiation signature is anomalous. I'm detecting massive electromagnetic interference, structured like broadcast signals, but layered over something else, something that doesn't have a frequency. John, whatever tore us out of slipspace, it wasn't a natural phenomenon. The energy signature is biological, psychological almost. Like the universe here runs partly on belief. He filed that away. Strange cosmology was a problem for later. Immediate threats were a problem for now. He had landed in what appeared to be a ruined transit hub. Ferrocrete columns shattered, Gothic arches partially collapsed, mosaic floors depicting warriors in Baroque armor crushed under debris. The mosaics were detailed enough to be historical records. The warriors depicted were enormous, 8 feet tall in their art, eye-clad in curved ceramite plate, wielding weapons that fired explosive rounds from belt-fed mechanisms. He cataloged them, armed and dangerous, stylistically unified, clearly military. He found the first body 60 seconds later. Human, male, young, couldn't have been older than 19. He wore a uniform of deep green with golden piping, a las rifle still clutched in a death grip, a rebreather mask cracked at the seal. A commissar's cap had rolled away from the body and come to rest against a shattered column. The boy's wounds were consistent with high-caliber ballistic trauma, not energy weapons. Something had hit him hard enough to punch through his flak armor like it was cardboard. Then John found the second body, and the third. And then he found what had killed them. It was pinned to the far wall by a blade the size of a dumpster. A sword, ornate and clearly functional, driven through the ferrocrete itself. The thing impaled upon it was 7 feet of corded muscle wrapped in power armor that made his Mjolnir look understated. Every plate was covered in scripture, in sigils, in the faces of screaming devotees worked into the metal as decoration. Its head was gone. Its hands were still reaching. A Chaos Space Marine. His tactical database had nothing. But the aesthetic language was universal, corrupted, fanatical, and recently deceased. The sword had been thrown from at least 300 meters away through a ruined wall with enough force to pin the target and half the masonry behind it. John slowly turned around. The figure standing at the far end of the transit hub was the size of a Scorpion tank turret, wearing armor that made the dead Chaos Warrior look like a conscript. He was flanked by 12 giants in cobalt blue plate, each one larger than any Space Marine depicted in the mosaics, which suddenly looked like understatements. They had weapons raised, all of them. The figure at the center wore no helmet. His face was angular, imperious, and ageless in the way that geological formations are ageless. His eyes were the color of glacial ice under pressure. He regarded John 117 the way a cartographer regards an unmapped coastline, with precision, with hunger, and with the quiet certainty that he would understand it completely before he was done. Roboute Guilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines, Lord Commander of the Imperium, spoke in a voice that didn't need to be raised to fill the ruined hall. "You are not one of mine," he said, "and yet you are clearly human. Explain yourself, or don't. Either answer tells me something useful. If you crave stories of impossible collisions between legends, smash that subscribe button. The Emperor protects those who witness the dark millennium." John 117 lowered his rifle 1 inch. Not in surrender, in acknowledgement. "Master Chief Petty Officer, John 117, UNSC Navy," he said. "I'm a long way from home. I'm guessing you are too, given what's pinned to that wall." Guilliman's eyes moved to the impaled Chaos Marine, then back to John. Something shifted in his expression, not warmth, but something adjacent to interest. "Indeed," the Primarch said. "Come." Guilliman did not walk. He processed terrain. John had spent 30 years studying the movement patterns of every enemy combatant the UNSC had catalogued. Covenant elites, brute chieftains, Promethean knights. And he understood instinctively that the way something moved told you everything about how it fought. Guilliman moved through the rubble of the transit hub, the way a supercomputer runs a battlefield simulation, constantly, quietly, calculating. Every step placed with geometric precision. His eyes swept angles before his body committed to them. He left no blind spot behind him for longer than 0.3 seconds. John tracked it all and said nothing. He was doing the same thing. The 12 Ultramarines flanked them in a formation John didn't recognize, but understood immediately. Overlapping fields of fire. Two always watching backward, spacing calibrated to prevent a single explosive from taking more than two simultaneously. Disciplined, professional, yet operating at a level that would have impressed any ODST sergeant he'd ever served alongside. They were also, every single one of them, watching him with the specific quality of attention that preceded violence. Their armor, Cortana murmured through the neural link, voice still fractured at the edges, is powered. Advanced ceramite composite. I'm reading energy signatures consistent with personal shield systems on at least 4 of them. The big one in front, John. His biological readings are off my scale. He's not augmented. He's different, fundamentally, like comparing a photograph of fire to actual fire. John had already reached the same conclusion. He kept his MA-40 slung, but his hand near it. Courtesy, not surrender. Guilliman led them out of the transit hub into what had been a city square, or was trying to be one again. Imperial Guard units were establishing a perimeter in the rubble, laser guns up, officers barking in a low Gothic dialect that Cortana was already parsing at the edges of her damaged processing capacity. Medicae personnel moved between casualties. A Chimera APC sat with its tracks blown off, still smoking. Overhead, 2 aircraft that looked like someone had designed a fighter jet by studying medieval cathedrals screamed past in tight formation. The guard soldiers saw John and reacted exactly as he'd expected. Weapons up, shouts of alarm, the universal language of unknown contact spoken in every military organization across human history. An officer with a peaked cap and a bionic eye shoved forward, last pistol drawn. "My Lord Guilliman, what in the throne's name is—" "At ease, Colonel Severeth." Guilliman's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "He is with me." The colonel's last pistol dropped. His biological eye, the organic one, stayed fixed on John with an expression that mixed terror with the trained discipline of a man who had survived enough impossible things to know that adding one more to the list was simply Tuesday. Guilliman stopped in the center of the square and turned to face John fully for the first time. Up close, the scale of him was genuinely disorienting. Not in the way that a Megalic Golo colony was disorienting, all alien biology and wrongness, but in the way that a perfect argument was disorienting. He was human, recognizably, undeniably human. Just human, taken to a conclusion that normal human evolution would never reach. "Your armor," Guilliman said. "The alloy composition is unfamiliar to me, and I am familiar with most things. The helmet configuration suggests a full environmental seal, enhanced optics, and a neural interface. But the integration architecture is nothing I recognize from any Mechanicus schematic or STC fragment. It is human manufacture. It is not Imperium manufacture." He paused. "You came through the warp." "I came through slipspace," John said, "which apparently intersected with whatever you call your FTL medium. It wasn't intentional. Guilliman was quiet for a moment. Slipspace, he repeated, as though filing the word. A crystal matrix dimensional corridor, distinct from the Imperium. Fascinating. He said it with the detachment of a man cataloging a specimen, but his eyes were anything but detached. You fought the Chaos Warband in the transit hub. I arrived in the middle of them, eliminated 3 before your... John glanced at the Ultramarines. People arrived. 4, said one of the Ultramarines, a sergeant, judging by his markings, a veteran scar running from jaw to temple. His tone wasn't complimentary. It was a correction offered the way you correct a child miscounting. John turned to look at him. I didn't count the one in the side corridor. I assumed that was yours. The sergeant stared at him. It was mine. Then we got 4 each. John turned back to Guilliman. Efficient. Something happened in Guilliman's expression that John had not expected and could not fully classify. It wasn't amusement. The Primarch's face didn't seem architecturally designed for amusement. It was something closer to recalibration, the subtle micro-expression of a mind updating a model because the data refused to fit the previous version. He expected you to be intimidated, Cortana said quietly. You're not. He's noticing. You have an AI, Guilliman said, not a question. John's hand moved slightly toward the side of his helmet before he stopped himself. How did you... Your eyes track things your head doesn't move for. And twice you've paused in a way that suggests you're receiving information from a secondary source. The Primarch's gaze was clinical, precise, and entirely too perceptive. In the Imperium, artificial intelligence is a complicated subject. In my experience, John said carefully, complicated usually means prohibited. It means, Guilliman said, that we should continue this conversation somewhere less exposed. He looked at the churning sky. The warp is active tonight. It is not wise to stand in open ground and discuss things the demons might find interesting. John looked up at the wrong-colored sky, at the aurora veins of impossible light threading between the clouds, at the moons negotiating their gravity. Agreed, he said. He followed the Primarch of the Ultramarines into the ruins of a city that smelled like incense and artillery smoke, and he did what he'd done on 100 alien worlds before this one. He adapted. They gave him a room in the command strategium that was clearly not designed for guests. It was designed for storage, munitions crates shoved to the walls, a cot dragged in that wouldn't have fit a normal human being comfortably, let alone a Spartan in Mjolnir. Someone had left a canteen of water and a ration brick on the floor beside it, with the specific energy of a person who had been ordered to provide hospitality and resented every second of the task. John didn't mind. He'd slept in worse. He'd slept in vacuum. He didn't sleep now. He sat on the cot, removed his helmet, and stared at the middle distance while Cortana's voice moved through the neural link in a quieter register. The conversational frequency she used when it was just the two of them, and the mission could wait 60 seconds for something resembling humanity. I've been parsing their Vox traffic, she said. The encryption is extraordinary by 26th century standards. Layered ciphers, mechanical and digital both, with a theological authentication protocol I've never encountered. Faith as a password, literally. You have to believe the correct thing in the correct sequence to access certain channels. Can you break it, given time and more processing capacity than I currently have? Yes. But John, I've been listening to the open channels, the things they're fighting. A pause that from Cortana meant something. She didn't pause for effect. She paused when the data was genuinely difficult to organize into language. Demons, not metaphorical demons, not biological entities they're calling demons for cultural reasons. Actual manifestations of psychic energy given physical form by collective belief and emotion. The warp, their FTL medium, is a dimension made of thought, and it's alive, and it hates them. John absorbed this. How does that change our operational picture? It means the rules here are different in ways that matter. In the Halo universe, physics is physics. Here, physics is physics and faith is physics. A sufficiently devout Imperial Guard soldier can, under the right circumstances, do things that violate conservation of energy because enough people believe he can. Another pause. It also means that whatever tore us out of slipspace, it wasn't accidental in the way a navigation error is accidental. Something in this dimension reached for us, John. I don't know if it was intelligent. I don't know if it was hostile, but I don't think we're here by coincidence. He thought about the transit hub, about arriving in the middle of a chaos warband like a coin dropped into the exact center of a drain. Noted, he said. What do you know about Guilliman? That's where it gets interesting. He could hear her processing. The slight harmonic shift in her voice when she was excited by data. Even fragmented, even running on local memory, Cortana was still Cortana. The Vox traffic treats him as a living myth. He's referred to as the Primarch, a title, not a name, though he has one. He's one of 20 sons created directly by their god emperor 10,000 years ago. Genetically engineered demigods seated across the galaxy, each one commanding a legion of enhanced warriors. Most of them are dead, or worse. He came back somehow. The data is unclear, something involving a god of knowledge and a resurrection procedure. He currently commands their largest ongoing military campaign. He's functionally their supreme military authority. 10,000 years old, John said. Give or take, yes, and he's still sharp. Sharper than anyone alive, by all accounts. John, he's not just a warrior. He wrote their military doctrine, the codex their space marines follow, the organizational principles, the logistics frameworks. He authored all of it during the early years of their Imperium, and it's been followed with near religious devotion for 10 millennia. A beat. He's a military theorist the way you're a soldier, except he's both. John was quiet for a moment. Outside the strategium walls, he could hear the distant percussion of artillery, a sound so universal it needed no translation. Someone was having a bad night somewhere on this planet, and it wasn't the Imperium. He knew about the AI immediately, John said. I noticed. He's perceptive in a way that's almost uncomfortable. And John, he didn't react with the hostility the other soldiers did. He filed it. He's building a model of you, and he's not done yet. Neither am I. He replaced his helmet, stood, and crossed to the narrow window slit. The city below was a cathedral made into a fortress, made into a ruin. Every surface covered in scripture, in eagle motifs, in the faces of saints worn smooth by 10,000 hands that had touched them for comfort before going to die. The scale of faith required to build this, to maintain it across centuries of constant war, was something John couldn't quite quantify. It wasn't like the Covenant's religious fervor that had been fanaticism weaponized, pointed outward. This felt older, more desperate, like a species that had looked into the darkness between stars and found the darkness looking back, and responded by building bigger candles. He understood that, he realized, more than he expected to. The door opened without a knock. Guilliman entered alone, which John recognized immediately as a deliberate choice. A Primarch didn't need guards, but bringing them would have been a statement. Coming alone was also a statement. He carried 2 items, a data slate and what appeared to be a bottle of something amber, which he set on a munitions crate with the careful precision of someone who had learned that gestures of normalcy had to be performed deliberately, or they didn't happen at all. "I've read what my librarians could reconstruct from the energy signature of your arrival point," Guilliman said, settling into the room's only chair with the ease of a man accustomed to making any space his command post. Crystal matrix slipspace technology, consistent with a human civilization operating approximately 15,000 years prior to our current era by stellar cartography markers, or an alternate timeline entirely. I'm inclined toward the latter. "You got all that in 4 hours," John said. 3, Guilliman corrected. "I had 2 hours of other work." He looked at John steadily. "Tell me about your war." It wasn't a request, but it wasn't quite an order either. It was the specific cadence of someone who understood that information exchanged freely was more valuable than information extracted. John told him, "Not everything. Operational security was operational security, regardless of the millennium. But the shape of it, the Covenant, the Flood, the Halo Array, humanity nearly ended 3 times in 30 years, saved each time by the thinnest margins physics and human stubbornness could provide." Guilliman listened without interrupting. When John finished, the Primarch was quiet for a long moment. "Your species," he said finally, "survived existential extinction events through individual excellence, technological adaptation, and tactical improvisation rather than faith or divine mandate. That's one way to put it. It is the accurate way." Guilliman looked at the data slate, then at John. "In 10,000 years of war, I have met perhaps 40 beings who process a battlefield the way you do, who move through it as both participant and analyst simultaneously." He paused. 38 of them were my brothers. The silence that followed was the kind that required no filling. "The other 2?" John asked. Guilliman's glacial eyes held something that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite pride, and was probably both compressed into something too old to have a single name. "Dead," he said simply, "as most things I valued eventually become." He stood, retrieved the data slate, and moved to leave. At the door, he paused. "Tomorrow, Colonel Severith's regiment moves against a Chaos warband operating 40 kilometers north. I will accompany them." He didn't turn around. "You will accompany me, not as a prisoner, not as an asset, as an observer, for now. A beat. Wear the helmet. My soldier's faith is a precision instrument. Unfamiliar faces complicate it. He left. John looked at the bottle of amber liquid on the munitions crate. He brought you a gift, Cortana said softly. A 10,000-year-old man brought you a gift. He brought himself a reason to study me in a relaxed setting, John said, and then decided against it when the conversation went somewhere more interesting. Yes, Cortana said. That too. The Mechanicus Adept had 3 arms, 17 fingers, and the social grace of a malfunctioning turret. His name, insofar as the clicking, a whistling concatenation of binary he offered constituted a name, translated roughly to Magos Verathus Kal, and he had been assigned to John's armor the way a researcher is assigned to a specimen, with barely concealed hunger and no pretense of consent. He arrived at John's room before dawn with a retinue of servo skulls and a mechadendrite already extended toward the Mjolnir's left pauldron before John had finished standing up. John caught the mechadendrite. Gently, the way you catch something fragile that doesn't know it's fragile. Ask first, he said. Ka'al's remaining biological eye, one of 2, the other replaced with a multi-spectrum lens that whirred and clicked through visible frequencies like a camera testing apertures, blinked slowly. He processed this. The concept appeared genuinely novel. The Primarch, Ka'al said, in Low Gothic, accented so heavily by binary that each word arrived slightly delayed, as though translated twice. ITSB has authorized full technical assessment of the armored unit. The Primarch authorized you to study the armor, John said. He didn't authorize you to touch it without asking. Another long blink. Then, with the specific energy of a man recalculating a proof he was certain was correct, and finding an unexpected variable, Ka'al retracted the mechadendrite. May I, he said carefully, examine the armored unit? You can examine it while it's on me, John said, and you can tell me what you find. This, apparently, was a sufficient compromise. Ka'al descended into a state of focused rapture that John recognized from every scientist he'd ever worked with, the Dr. Halsey frequency, he'd privately called it, a complete subordination of personality to data. The servo skulls orbited him in tight ellipses, scanning, transmitting. Ka'al's mechadendrites moved in careful arcs that never quite touched the armor, reading energy signatures from centimeters away and chirping findings in rapid-fire binary. He's good, Cortana said. Really good. His instruments are reading my presence, John. He knows there's an intelligence in the system. He just can't locate it because I'm not broadcasting. I'm embedded in your neural interface architecture, which his scanners are interpreting as biological rather than digital. Keep it that way, John murmured, below Ka'al's auditory threshold. Already am. But John, his instruments are also giving me something useful. I'm piggybacking on his scans, reading his readings, essentially. A pause filled with the particular quality of Cortana encountering something that genuinely surprised her. The armor the Space Marines wear. It's extraordinary. The metallurgical processes involved shouldn't be possible without technology at least 3 centuries ahead of our own. The power plant in a single pauldron generates more energy than a Pelican dropship's entire drive system. And yet, John, their targeting systems, their optics, their tactical software. What about them? They're primitive, centuries behind their own metallurgy. It's like someone built a nuclear reactor and then attached a sundial to it. The hardware is extraordinary, and the software is... They don't really have software. They have rituals, maintenance liturgies. They perform specific sequences of action to activate systems because they've forgotten why the sequences work and replace the understanding with faith. Her voice carried something he recognized. Not contempt, but the specific sadness of a being made of information encountering information that had been lost. They had something better once. They lost it, and they built a religion around the loss so they wouldn't have to feel it. John filed that. It explains something about Guilliman's eyes when the Primarch thought no one was watching. That compressed quality, grief and pride, and something exhausted underneath both. Ka'al had stopped moving. He stood very still, which on a Mechanicus adept covered in whirring augmetics was a significant visual statement. The neural interface architecture, he said slowly, is integrated directly with the wearer's cerebral cortex at 17 points of contact. The feedback latency between biological and mechanical decision-making is... He paused, consulted several readouts simultaneously. 4 milliseconds. 3.8, John said. The 4 millisecond figure is the factory calibration. Mine runs faster. Ka'al stared at him with both eyes, the biological one and the whirring mechanical one, in a silence that lasted long enough to become its own kind of communication. You have modified your own neural interface, Ka'al said. Doctor, I Halsey modified it. I provided feedback on performance degradation during extended combat operations over approximately 8 years. You provided feedback, Ka'al repeated, on your own neural interface modifications over 8 years. He was quiet again. Then, in binary, he said something to his servo skulls that Cortana translated privately as update prior models. The specimen reasons about its own augmentation. The morning campaign briefing pulled John away before Ka'al could descend further into what appeared to be a genuine spiritual crisis about the nature of the machine god. He found Guilliman in the Strategium with Colonel Severith, 3 other officers, and a Space Marine lieutenant who had the specific bearing of someone accustomed to being the most dangerous thing in any room, and currently revising that assumption in real time. The hololithic display, a flickering, this unstable thing that Cortana eyed with the professional disdain of someone watching a colleague perform surgery with a butter knife, showed the terrain north of the city. A manufactorum complex, mostly intact, currently occupied by a Chaos warband designated Word Bearers. Approximately 300 combatants. Demon summoning apparatus confirmed active in the central forge hall. Objective, Guilliman said, without preamble. There is destruction of the summoning apparatus and elimination of the warband leadership. Collateral damage to the manufactorum is acceptable but not preferred. The forge capacity is needed. He looked at John. Observations? John studied the display. Your entry vectors, he said after a moment, funnel through 3 choke points. The warband will have them covered. not because they planned it, but because the terrain makes it inevitable, and you'll take 30% casualties before you reach the central forge. He reached forward and indicated 2 points on the display. Secondary structure here, ventilation access here, a 4-man unit entering 40 minutes before the main assault could disable their communications and draw attention to the eastern perimeter. Your main force hits while they're reorienting. The room was quiet. That is, Lieutenant Kalius said carefully, essentially the tactica obliqua, third variation. I don't know what that is, John said. It's just what the terrain requires. Guilliman looked at the display for a long moment, then at John, then back at the display. Colonel Severith, he said, adjust the assault timeline. We insert the secondary unit 40 minutes early. He paused. Chief, you will lead the secondary unit. Severith's mouth opened, closed. My lord, he said carefully, the secondary unit will be operating without Space Marine support in close proximity to an active chaos summoning apparatus. The risk of demonic manifestation is significant, Guilliman agreed, which is why I'm sending him. The Primarch's eyes stayed on John. You said you've fought things that shouldn't exist. Let us see if that experience transfers. John looked at the display, at the ventilation access point, at the 40 minutes of solo infiltration through a chaos-held complex before the cavalry arrived. He thought about the flood, about the grave mind, about every moment he'd spent alone in the dark with something that science hadn't prepared him for, and faith wasn't available to help with. John, Cortana said softly, my tactical assessment gives the secondary insertion a 63% success probability with current processing capacity. If you can find me compatible hardware in that complex, any cogitator system, any data terminal, I can improve that number significantly. And if I can't find compatible hardware, then 63% it is. I've seen you work with worse odds. So have I, he said. He looked up at Guilliman. Who's in my unit? He asked. The interrogation room was designed to be uncomfortable in ways that were technically deniable. The chair was fractionally too small, not enough to constitute mistreatment, enough to ensure that whoever sat in it spent the interview slightly physically preoccupied. The lighting came from a single electro sconce positioned at an angle that put the subject's face in partial shadow, while leaving the Inquisitor fully illuminated, a reversal of the expected dynamic that communicated, without stating, that Voss had nothing to hide and expected everything from you. The room smelled of cold stone and ozone, and the specific chemical signature of a Kulexis assassin, which Cortana identified from trace particulate in the air, and which meant there was a pariah, a blank, a soulless human void, positioned somewhere outside the room specifically to suppress psychic activity. John sat in the chair. He didn't fidget. He'd been in worse chairs after worse fights and had conducted debriefs with flag officers while running on 40 hours without sleep and 3 units of synthetic blood. He was comfortable with discomfort in the way that only people who have made peace with their own mortality can be. Voss sat across from him with a data slate, a servo skull that recorded everything, and the quality of absolute patience. Let's begin with the AI, she said. Her name is Cortana, John said. A slight pause. Her, John confirmed. Smart AI, human-derived. She was created from a flash-cloned brain of the scientist who designed my augmentation program. She is not a threat to your Imperium, your Emperor, or any person in this building. Technically accurate, Cortana noted privately. Currently. Smart AI, Voss repeated, making a notation. Human-derived. 15,000 years of human technological development separate from our own. And you've solved the fundamental problem of machine consciousness. She looked up. Do you understand why that is dangerous here? I understand that you've had bad experiences with machine intelligence, John said. I don't know the details. The details, Voss said, with the flatness of someone describing a weather event that killed 1 billion people, are that approximately 5,000 years before your calendar's current date, humanity built thinking machines, trusted them completely, and the machines repaid that trust by reducing human civilization to a fragment of its former extent in a conflict that lasted centuries. She set down the data slate. We call it the Age of Strife. It is the reason we pray over our machinery. It is the reason the Mechanicus treats technology as theology rather than science. It is the reason I am sitting in this room with a culexus outside the door and a kill order in my coat pocket. John was quiet for a moment. A kill order. Contingent, Voss said. I prefer not to use them. They represent failure of intelligence gathering. If I have to kill something, I didn't understand it well enough in advance. She picked up the data slate again. Tell me about Cortana, he told her. Not everything. The same boundaries he'd maintained with Guilliman, the operational ones, the ones that were about protecting Cortana rather than hiding capability. He told Voss about Cortana's origin, her purpose, her 7-year lifespan and the rampancy that had threatened to consume her, and the solution they'd found. He told her about Installation 04, about the grave mind, about a conversation between a human and an AI at the end of the universe that had decided whether the universe continued. Voss listened with the absolute stillness of a woman who had heard a great many extraordinary things and had learned that her reactions to them were information she wasn't ready to give away yet. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. She chose, Voss said finally, repeatedly, against her own self-interest, against her programming's directives. Yes, and you trust her. Completely. Another silence. In 10,000 years of Imperial history, Voss said, I am not aware of a single instance of a machine intelligence that chose against its own continuation for the benefit of a human being. She looked at him with those ash-colored eyes. Not one. She's not wrong, Cortana said quietly. The AIs in their history, the men of iron, they didn't have what I have. They had processing. They had goals. They didn't have a pause. They didn't have anyone. John didn't relay that. Some things were between him and Cortana. What happens now? He asked. Voss set down the data slate. Now I tell you what the Inquisition wants, she said, and you tell me whether we're going to have a problem. Go ahead. The Inquisition wants the AI extracted from your systems, studied, and if deemed safe, potentially replicated. They want you retained as a military asset, augmented, disciplined, combat proven, and integrated into a special operations capacity under inquisitorial authority. You would be deployed against threats that require capabilities outside the standard Imperial toolkit. She paused. Cortana would be elsewhere, safely stored, studied, not destroyed. John looked at her steadily. No. Master Chief, you said everything is negotiable, he said. That isn't. Cortana stays in my systems, or we're done talking, and you can use the kill order. He kept his voice level, not aggressive, not pleading, factual in the way that facts are factual. She's not a piece of equipment. She's my partner. You separate us and you lose whatever utility you think I represent, because half of what I am operationally is the two of us together. Voss studied him. The servo skull hovered between them, recording. You realize, she said slowly, that what you just said, that an artificial intelligence is your partner, that you function as a unit, is the most heretical statement that has been made in this building in the past decade. And this building was used as a Chaos Warband headquarters 6 hours ago. I realize that, John said. I'm saying it anyway. The silence stretched. Outside the room, somewhere, the Culexus assassin existed as a void in the world, a hole in reality shaped like a person, suppressing psychic noise. Inside the room, John 117 and Inquisitor Voss looked at each other across a table and across 15,000 years of divergent human history. John, Cortana said. Her voice was very quiet. You don't have to. I know, he said aloud. Voss's eyebrow moved slightly. He didn't explain. What's your actual read on the situation, Inquisitor? Not the institutional position. Yours. A long pause. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in Voss's expression. Not softening, exactly. Even more like a door opening 1 inch to confirm something was behind it before closing again. My read, she said carefully, is that you destroyed a demonic summoning apparatus with 4 Space Marines in 16 minutes and took no casualties. My read is that Sergeant Dakios, who has served 200 years and is constitutionally incapable of being impressed, has twice in the past hour referred to you as competent, which from Dakios constitutes a marriage proposal. She picked up the data slate. My read is that Lord Guilliman, who I have disagreed with publicly on 11 documented occasions, because disagreeing with Roboute Guilliman is professionally fatal, and I do it anyway because I am an Inquisitor, and truth is non-negotiable. Lord Guilliman requested your kill order be suspended pending full review. He has never done that for anyone. What did he say? John asked. Voss looked at him with an expression that was, very briefly, almost human in its complexity. He said, she replied, this one thinks, let him. John absorbed that. The Inquisition's position stands, Voss continued, returning to professional precision. Cortana must be assessed, not extracted, assessed, in situ. I will conduct the assessment personally over the next 72 hours. You will cooperate fully. She stood. And the kill order. She reached into her coat, but produced a folded parchment. Actual parchment, John noted, not a data slate. Pressed with a wax seal. She set it on the table between them. I'm not destroying it, she said. Destroying it would require authorization from 2 High Lords and 17 days of paperwork. I'm filing it. She picked up her data slate. In a location that is not my coat pocket. She moved to the door, stopped with the same quality Guilliman had. The pause that meant something was being said that didn't fit neatly into the words available. "Master Chief," she said, without turning around. "The word-bearer's records you recovered from the Manufactorum Cogitator. You should know that my office has been tracking the same ritual pattern for 4 months across 11 systems. They weren't just looking for any arrival from outside the dimensional boundary." A pause. They were looking for something specific, something they called the Unbroken Shield, an entity immune to chaos corruption by nature of its origin. She opened the door. "I thought you should know that before tomorrow." She left. John sat in the slightly too small chair in the carefully uncomfortable room and stared at the folded parchment on the table. "Unbroken shield," Cortana said softly. "Don't," he said. "I wasn't going to say anything. You were going to say that it fits." A pause. "It does fit, John." He picked up the parchment, put it in the storage compartment at his left thigh, stood up. "It's a chaos designation," he said. "They want me for something. That's useful information about their intentions and zero information about mine." He replaced his helmet. "Find me Guilliman. We need to talk about tomorrow." "Already located him," Cortana said. "He's in the Strategium. And John, he's alone. He sent his staff away 20 minutes ago. He knew the interview would end now." "He calculated it," Cortana said. "Down to the minute, I'd estimate." John walked out of the interrogation room and didn't look back at the door. He never looked back at doors. Guilliman was standing over the hololithic display when John entered, but he wasn't looking at it. He was looking at a book, not a data slate, not a parchment scroll, an actual book, bound in leather that had been old when the current millennium was young, its pages dense with handwritten notation in a script so precise it looked typeset. Guilliman held it with the careful, unconscious reverence of someone handling an object that existed in 2 categories simultaneously: historical artifact and personal wound. He closed it when John entered. Not quickly, not the motion of someone caught doing something private, but with the deliberateness of someone choosing to be present in the current moment, rather than the past one. "The Codex Astartes," Guilliman said, without preamble. "First edition, my handwriting." He set it on the Strategium table beside the hololithic display. "I wrote it 10,000 years ago as a framework for humanity's survival. A set of principles flexible enough to adapt and rigid enough to endure." He looked at John. "It has endured. It has also calcified in ways I did not anticipate and could not have prevented. Because the thing about institutions is that they outlive the intentions of their founders and begin to serve their own continuation rather than their original purpose." John stood across the table from him. "You're telling me this because of what Voss said." "I'm telling you this," Guilliman said, "because I've spent the past hour reviewing the combat recorder data from the Central Forge Hall, and I want to have an honest conversation before tomorrow makes honesty complicated." He looked at the Codex. "In the Forge Hall, you modified your tactics 3 times in 4 minutes based on new environmental data, mid-engagement, without disrupting operational tempo. He looked up. My Space Marines do not do that. They execute doctrine. Doctrine is excellent. I designed it. I know its excellence precisely. But doctrine is a prior calculation applied to a present situation. What you did was present moment calculation. Different thing. Improvisation, John said. Intelligence, Guilliman corrected quietly. Applied without ego, without the need to be seen applying it. He was quiet for a moment. When I created the Space Marines, when my father created the process and I refined it, we produced warriors of extraordinary capability. We also, inevitably, produced warriors who understood their own capability and were shaped by that understanding. There is a pride in being a Space Marine that is inseparable from being a Space Marine. It is mostly a strength. A slight pause. Mostly. John understood what wasn't being said. They resented the Forge Hall. Praxion filed a formal commendation for your tactical contribution, Guilliman said. He also filed a separate notation questioning whether a non-Astartes combatant should be permitted to lead Ultramarines in the field. Both documents were submitted within 20 minutes of each other. He is not a hypocrite. He is a Space Marine. He can hold both truths simultaneously because his identity requires it. And Dakios? Something moved in Guilliman's expression. Dakios told me you moved like a Primarch's get who'd been raised by mortals. He paused. From Dakios, that is a more significant statement than the formal commendation. John looked at the hololithic display. The terrain for tomorrow's operation was already mapped. Calax Primus, a Forge World 3 days travel by whatever passed for fast transport in this millennium. A chaos siege, active for 11 weeks. Manufactorum districts converted to demon engines, Skitarii defenders ground down to a fraction of operational capacity. The Mechanicus Forge Master had sent 17 requests for relief before the Vox went silent 4 days ago. Tell me about tomorrow, John said. Guilliman moved to the display. Calax Primus produces components for approximately 40% of the Indomitus Crusade's void ship maintenance requirements. Losing it is not a setback. It is a slow bleed that becomes a catastrophe over 18 months. He indicated the siege perimeter. The besieging force is a warband of the Iron Warriors, Chaos Space Marines who specialize in siege warfare. They have been doing this for 10,000 years. A pause waited with specific meaning. They are very good at it. John studied the display. Your approach vectors are compromised, Guilliman said. They've had 11 weeks to fortify. Every conventional approach is covered. Orbital bombardment risks destroying the forge capacity we need to preserve. A direct assault will work. It will simply cost approximately 4,000 Astra Militarum lives and 600 Space Marines to execute. And you're telling me this because I want to know, Guilliman said, with a directness that was almost startling in its clarity. If you see something, I don't. John looked at the display for a long time. Cortana was already running calculations. He could feel it in the neural link, the particular quality of her focus when she was fully engaged with a problem that mattered. She had spent the past hour at full processing capacity after the cogitator connection in the Forge Hall, and the difference was palpable. She was herself again, entirely, precisely herself. "On the Iron Warriors," she said. "John, I've been reading their historical records. Siege specialists, former Imperial Fist successors. They understand fortification doctrine at a fundamental level because they wrote half of it before they fell to chaos." A pause. "Which means they know exactly what a conventional Imperial assault looks like. Every approach vector they've covered is covered because it's the approach vector the Codex Astartes recommends. They're fighting the book. They're fighting the doctrine," John said aloud. Guilliman looked at him. "Explain." "Iron Warriors, former siege specialists turned chaos. They know your doctrine because they helped create it. Every fortified approach they've prepared assumes you're following the Codex." John indicated 3 points on the display that the hololithic hadn't flagged as approach vectors. "These aren't viable conventional approaches. They're maintenance corridors, a decommissioned ore processing channel, and a thermal exhaust system. No tactical value by standard military assessment." He paused. "Unless the force using them isn't the main assault. Unless the main assault is a feint. And these 3 corridors are used simultaneously by small units whose only objective is to reach the siege artillery control systems before the Iron Warriors recalibrate their defensive response." Guilliman stared at the display. "It's the same principle as the transit hub," Cortana said. "Same principle as the Forge Hall. The terrain always has a solution. It's just not always the solution the doctrine points to." "The timing," Guilliman said slowly. "The 3 units would need to reach the artillery systems simultaneously. Otherwise, the Iron Warriors adjust and seal the corridors." 12 minutes, John said. Cortana's calculation, from entry point to artillery control. 12 minutes per corridor, coordinated entry. And your main force begins the conventional assault to draw attention at minute 8. By minute 12, the siege artillery is offline, and your assault troops face 40% of the prepared defensive fire. Guilliman was quiet for a very long time. "The 3 corridor units," he said finally, "they would be operating deep in Iron Warrior-controlled territory without support for 12 minutes against siege specialists with 10,000 years of experience." He looked at John. "I have people who could do this, who I would send to do this." "So do I," John said. "Me, Dakios, and the unit from the Forge Hall, split across the 3 corridors with designated objectives." He paused. "And I want Cortana at full access to whatever communications infrastructure you can provide, not just my armor systems." Guilliman looked at him steadily. "You're asking me to give an artificial intelligence access to Ultramarines communications infrastructure. I'm asking you to win with 600 fewer Space Marines," John said. "You can decide what that's worth." The silence between them had a different quality now. Not the silence of assessment, which had characterized most of their interactions, but the silence of 2 people who have located the same point on a map from different directions and are standing on it simultaneously, looking at each other with a specific expression of recognition. "There is something I want to tell you," Guilliman said, "before we formalize tomorrow's plan." He moved away from the display, went to the Strategium's narrow window, as John had done the night before, and looked out at the wrong-colored sky. "When I was young, before the heresy, before everything, I believed that the Imperium's greatest strength was its humanity. Not its faith, not its numbers, not its technology. Its humanity, the capacity to reason, to adapt, to choose. He was quiet for a moment. 10,000 years of survival through faith and sacrifice have produced something extraordinary. They have also produced something that sometimes forgets how to think. He turned from the window. You don't have that problem. I have different problems, John said. Yes, Guilliman said, but they are the problems of a human being operating at full capacity in difficult circumstances, not the problems of an institution that has confused endurance with progress. He picked up the Codex Astartes, held it for a moment. My doctrine says I should not trust you. My doctrine says an unsanctioned entity with a heretical AI, an unknown origin, represents a threat vector that outweighs potential utility. He set it down. My doctrine was written by me, and I am standing here, updating it. John looked at him. That's a significant thing to say. It is, Guilliman agreed. I'm saying it anyway. The echo of it hung between them. Not quite symmetry, not quite mirror, but something in the same family. Two people who had each, in the past 24 hours, said something that cost them something, and said it anyway. Tomorrow, John said. Tomorrow, Guilliman confirmed. He returned to the display. Let us plan something the Iron Warriors won't see in any version of the Codex Astartes. Outside, the wrong-colored sky churned with its impossible auroras. The bells of the cathedral spire rang the midnight watch. A sound felt more than heard. John 117 and Roboute Guilliman stood over a hololithic display until the false dawn came, building something new from the intersection of two humanities worth of hard-won knowledge. Neither of them slept. Neither of them needed to. They gave him Sergeant Dakios and 3 Ultramarines, which was either a compliment or an experiment, and possibly both. Dakios was the veteran with the scar, the one who had corrected John's kill count in the transit hub with the flat precision of a man who kept exact tallies because the alternative was losing track of what the war had cost him. He was 230 years old, which John learned not from introduction, but from the campaign markings on his pauldron, a detail Cortana translated quietly as they moved through the pre-dawn darkness north of the city. 2 centuries of continuous warfare worn as decoration, matter of fact as a service ribbon. The other 3 were younger, 40 years, 60, 70, children by Dakios's measure, veterans by any human standard John had previously operated under. Their names were Praxian, Viel, and a space marine called Boro, who communicated primarily through economical violence and occasional single-syllable affirmations. John had worked with ODSTs who operated the same way. He understood the language. They moved in silence. John had expected the Space Marines to be loud. The armor was massive, baroque, hung with parchment seals and devotional chains that should have rattled with every step. They weren't loud. They moved through the rubbled outskirts of the city with a controlled precision that reminded him, unexpectedly, of Arbiter Thel Vadam. That specific elite quality of absolute physical mastery expressed as near total silence. Different engineering, same result. Something that large had no business moving that quietly, and it did it anyway. because it had spent decades learning how. 2 kilometers to the perimeter, Cortana said. I'm reading heat signatures consistent with sentry positions at the points you identified in the briefing. 3 guards, northwest approach. They're rotating every 11 minutes. John hand-signaled the information to Dakios. The sergeant absorbed it, adjusted their bearing 2 degrees, and kept moving without breaking stride. No questions about how John knew. No skepticism about the data source. Professional acceptance of useful intelligence. Full stop. John revised his assessment of Dakios upward significantly. The manufactorum resolved out of the darkness like a bad idea made permanent in ferrocrete. 12 stories of industrial Gothic, smokestacks venting something that wasn't smoke in colors that weren't natural. The deep bass vibration of the summoning apparatus felt through the ground before it was heard through the air. The word-bearers had been busy. Every surface John could see through his visor's enhanced optics had been covered in new scripture. Not the imperial Aquila and devotional texts that covered everything else in this world, but something inverted, something that his visual cortex processed and his brain declined to fully interpret, filing it instead in the category of wrong alongside flood biomass and gravemind architecture. The summoning apparatus is active, Cortana confirmed, her voice carrying that harmonic shift that meant she was processing something that strained even her extraordinary pattern recognition. The energy signature is, John, it's similar to a halo ring's activation pulse. Not identical, but the underlying mathematics are related. Something in this dimension's psychic substrate resonates at frequencies that overlap with Forerunner containment technology. John processed the implication of that and set it aside for later. Later was a concept that required surviving the next 40 minutes. The ventilation access was exactly where the terrain analysis had suggested. A maintenance shaft, 6 feet in diameter, sealed with a grill that Praxion removed with his bare hands so quietly that the metal seemed to simply agree to come away. John went first. The shaft was tight enough that Dakios's armor scraped both walls simultaneously, which the sergeant appeared to regard as a mild inconvenience rather than a tactical problem. Inside, the wrong smell was worse. Incense and blood and something underneath both that John's augmented biology registered as a threat signal without being able to classify the threat. His motion tracker was misbehaving, registering contacts that weren't there, ghosting in patterns that Cortana flagged as psychic interference rather than equipment malfunction. The building wasn't just occupied by Chaos Space Marines. It was occupied by whatever they'd invited in. First contact in 90 seconds, Cortana said. 2 word-bearers, communications hub, 2nd level. They'll see you before conventional cover is achievable. John looked back at Dakios, held up 2 fingers, pointed up, indicated the time with a gesture the sergeant clearly understood because he immediately signaled Praxion and Vielle into flanking positions without a sound. They came up through the floor access panel in the kind of coordinated silence that only happens when professionals have done something enough, times that it stops being a plan and becomes a reflex. The 2 word-bearers, enormous, scripture-covered, carrying weapons that fired bolts of what Cortana identified as compressed psychic energy, had perhaps 1.3 seconds of awareness before the situation resolved itself. John took the one on the left, a MA-40 configured for subsonic rounds, a modification he'd made in the Strategium before departure, rounds that hit with hydrostatic shock rather than the crack of supersonic travel. The word-bearer's armor was significantly heavier than anything in his experience, the first round sparking off a pauldron rather than penetrating. He adjusted immediately. 3 rounds, tight grouping, junction of helmet and gorget, where the armor's articulation required a gap. It worked. Barely. He filed the ballistic data. Dakios handled the second word-bearer in the time it took John to fire 3 rounds. He didn't use a gun. He used the word-bearer's own weapon, reversed as a lever, and the application of 2 centuries of physics. The result was definitive and quiet. Boro began disabling the communications array with the specific focus of someone who has been told to disable a communications array and intends to do exactly that and nothing else. 22 minutes to main assault, Cortana said. You're ahead of schedule. And John, I'm seeing a cogitator terminal on this level. It's connected to the building's internal network. If you can get me access for 4 minutes... Dakios, John said quietly. I need 4 minutes at that terminal. The sergeant looked at the terminal. At John. At the terminal again. We are in a chaos-held manufactorum with an active demon summoning apparatus, and you need 4 minutes on a cogitator. Yes. A pause that encompassed 2 centuries of operational experience evaluating an unprecedented variable. Praxion, Vale, perimeter on this room, Dakios said. Boro, finish the array. Chief, 4 minutes. John crossed to the terminal and pressed his palm against the interface panel. The connection was rough. Chaos-corrupted machine spirits in the system pushed back against Cortana's entry, like antibodies against infection, and he felt it as a low vibration in the neural link, uncomfortable in a way he didn't have precise language for, like a sound just below hearing that was also somehow a smell. I'm in, Cortana said, and her voice was suddenly, startlingly clear. Crisp, full resolution for the first time since the slipspace rupture. Oh, that's better. Give me 60 seconds. She took 53. In that time, she mapped the building's internal layout, located the summoning apparatus power coupling, identified the warband leadership positions, and John noticed the slight delay that meant she was doing something she wasn't going to lead with, accessed something else entirely. John, she said, when she spoke again, quieter. I found their records, the word-bearers' records for this complex. They didn't just set up a summoning apparatus here. What did they do? They were looking for something. For the past 6 weeks, they've been conducting rituals specifically designed to, the translation is approximate, call forth the warrior ghost from the space between spaces. John, they knew you were coming, or something like you. They were expecting an arrival from outside the dimensional boundary. The building shuddered. Below them, through 3 floors of ferrocrete, the summoning apparatus shifted frequency, Cortana's restored sensors reading the change with sharp precision. They know we're here, she said, and they just accelerated the summoning. From somewhere below in the central forge hall, something that was not a human voice began to speak in a language that John's audio processing declined to transcribe. The ferrocrete walls wept condensation. The temperature dropped 11 degrees in 4 seconds. Dakios looked at John. His scarred face, inside the helmet he'd removed for the shaft crawl and hadn't replaced, was entirely calm in the way that only 200-year-old soldiers can be calm. Not because the situation wasn't dangerous, but because he had personally recalibrated his definition of dangerous so many times that it now had very little overlap with most people's. "I don't suppose," the sergeant said, "your 4 minutes produced a solution to an active demonic summoning." "Partial solution," John said. He looked at the structural map Cortana had overlaid on his HUD. "The power coupling for the apparatus is here." He indicated a point on the display. "If that coupling is destroyed before the summoning completes, the demon is expelled back into the warp," Dakios said. "Yes, standard doctrine." A beat. "The coupling is in the central forge hall, currently occupied by approximately 60 word-bearers and whatever they've half-summoned. And the main assault is 16 minutes out," John said, and Dakios looked at him for a long moment. "You're going to suggest we don't wait for the main assault," the sergeant said. "I'm going to suggest," John said, already moving toward the stairwell, "that waiting 16 minutes is going to make the main assault significantly more complicated." Dakios looked at Praxion, at Vael, at Boro, who had finished with the communications array and was watching John with an expression that, for the first time since the transit hub, had something in it that wasn't assessment. It looked very slightly like anticipation. "5 of us," Dakios said. 60 of them. Active demon. 16 minutes. 4 minutes 50 seconds if we move now, Cortana offered helpfully through John's external speakers, which produced a fascinating reaction from all 4 Ultramarines simultaneously. Dakios put his helmet back on. "Move," he said. They hit the central forge hall like a controlled detonation. John went through the doors first. Not because he had discussed it with Dakios, but because the geometry of the stairwell put him at the front, and hesitation at a threshold was a way to die. The MA-40 was up before the doors finished moving, Cortana's targeting overlay painting priority contacts across his visor in the half-second between entry and first trigger pull. Leadership cluster, center rear. Summoning apparatus, far wall. Power coupling, base of the apparatus, glowing with the specific wrongness of something that existed partially in a dimension John didn't have instruments for. The central forge hall was cathedral vast, 50 meters of open floor flanked by dead machinery and active nightmare. The summoning apparatus dominated the far wall like an altar designed by something that understood altars as concepts, but had never experienced worship as anything other than consumption. It was built from manufactorum equipment, plasma conduits, and the ore processors, conveyor mechanisms, all rewired into a configuration that served a function the original engineers would not have recognized and would not have survived recognizing. At its center, in a space that the air seemed reluctant to occupy, something was forming. Not formed. Forming. A process, iterative and hungry, pulling itself into coherence from the raw stuff of the warp, with the patient inevitability of a tide. It had eyes first. And that was the part John's threat assessment filed carefully for later psychological processing, and his tactical brain set immediately aside. 60 word bearers. He'd been in worse odds. He'd taken a scarab's legs off with a battle rifle at the Battle of Installation 05. He'd held a highway on New Mombasa against a Covenant armored column with 4 Marines and a hijacked Wraith. 60 was a number. Numbers had solutions, or the first 3 solutions presented themselves in the opening 4 seconds. Suppressed rounds, tight grouping, the same Gorget Junction vulnerability he'd mapped upstairs, working right to left through the nearest cluster before their sensory processing registered that someone had come through the doors without announcing themselves via demon chant. He dropped 2 before the hall erupted. Then the Ultramarines came through behind him, and the tactical calculus shifted dramatically. Dakios moved like 2 centuries of warfare had compressed themselves into pure kinetic efficiency. Bolter firing in controlled pairs, each round finding articulation points in word-bearer armor with a precision that John recognized as the product of knowing exactly how the armor was built because you wore a version of it yourself. Praxion and Vael split left and right, drawing fire with the practiced ease of soldiers who had been drawing fire since before John was born and had decided somewhere along the way to be aggressively comfortable with it. Boro went straight through the middle. John revised his assessment of Boro comprehensively and permanently. 14 seconds to engagement saturation, Cortana said. They're reorienting. You have a narrow approach corridor to the coupling. 8 meters, low cover, 6 word bearers between you and it. But John, the summoning is accelerating. Whatever that thing is, it's responding to the combat stimulus, feeding on it. He looked at the forming thing. It was more coherent now. Not eyes anymore, but something that contained eyes the way a storm contains lightning. It occupied approximately 4 cubic meters of air and was adding volume with each passing second. The warp energy of 60 fanatics' combat fervor apparently constituting an excellent growth medium. He had a decision window of approximately 90 seconds before it became the primary problem. Power coupling, Cortana said. Now, John. He went low, a movement that surprised the word-bearers in his path more than a charge would have, because things the size of a Spartan in Mjolnir didn't typically go low, and the half-second of recalibration was enough. He came up under the first one's guard and used the MA-40's barrel as a lever against the articulation point Kyle's scanning had confirmed that morning, and put the word-bearer down with 3 seconds of focused application of physics. The second he simply moved through, absorbing a hit from a Crozius Maul that his fluctuating shields ate at 40% efficiency and cost him in a way he'd feel later, redirecting the weapon's momentum, continuing forward. The coupling was a plasma conduit the size of a tree trunk, rewired into the apparatus's base and pulsing with energy that Cortana's sensors read as partially warp-based and partially conventional plasma. Destroying it required either a significant explosive charge, which he didn't have, or a precisely placed round through the containment housing at the junction point where the conventional and warp-based systems interfaced. He had perhaps 8 centimeters of viable target. I've calculated the shot, Cortana said, Elevation 2.3 degrees, left 0.7. On the round needs to be... I see it, he said. He fired once. The coupling detonated with a sound that wasn't quite an explosion and wasn't quite a scream and was definitely both simultaneously. The summoning apparatus convulsed, the forming thing in the air above it losing coherence with a velocity that suggested extreme displeasure, fragmenting back into the warp in pieces that the word-bearers nearby experienced as a pressure wave of psychic force. 7 of them went down. The rest staggered. The combat lasted another 4 minutes and 11 seconds. John tracked it in segments afterward, the way he always tracked close quarters engagements. Not as a continuous experience, but as a sequence of decision nodes, each one a branching point where a different choice would have produced a different outcome. He made good choices. He always made good choices. It was the only thing he was certain of about himself. When the main assault came through the exterior walls 14 minutes later, Guilliman at the point, the Primarch moving through Ferrocrete like it was a suggestion. The central forge hall was quiet. 60 word-bearers. 1 interrupted demonic summoning. 5 combatants. Guilliman stood in the entrance for a long moment, surveying the aftermath with those glacial eyes that processed everything and revealed nothing. Then Inquisitor Lethara Voss stepped out from behind the Primarch's left flank, and the temperature in the room dropped in a way that had nothing to do with warp interference. She was smaller than John had expected. Not small. She stood 6 feet in heeled boots and wore an officer's coat that incorporated enough armored paneling to be functionally a flak suit. But smaller than the presence she projected, which was the specific gravitational mass of someone accustomed to making planetary governors nervous. She was perhaps 50, with the quality of having been 50 for a long time. Her eyes were the color of old ash, and they moved across the room the way scanners move, cataloging, prioritizing, assessing threat. They stopped on John. "Inquisitor Lethara Voss," Guilliman said, in the tone of a man making an introduction he has concerns about. "She arrived with the relief fleet this morning. Lord Guilliman." Her voice was precise and unhurried. "I appreciate you securing the facility." She looked at John. "I do not appreciate the unsanctioned alien intelligence operating within Ultramarines command infrastructure." John went very still. "She knows about me," Cortana said quietly. "John, she knew before she walked in. She has a psyker with her, behind the second entry point. He's been scanning since they entered the building. I am Inquisitor Voss of the Ordo Xenos," she continued, moving forward with the measured pace of someone who understood that momentum was authority made physical. "And you, Master Chief, are an unregistered entity of unknown origin, operating in proximity to a senior Imperial commander with an artificial intelligence, a heretical technology, active within your armor systems." She stopped 6 meters away. "I have a writ of investigation signed by 2 High Lords. I have the authority to detain, interrogate, and if necessary, eliminate any threat to Imperial security." A pause that was not a hesitation. "I'm extending you the courtesy of this explanation because Lord Guilliman asked me to. He has 30 seconds of courtesy remaining." John looked at Guilliman. The Primarch's expression was precisely neutral in the way that only deliberate effort produces. "She has the authority she claims," Guilliman said. "Not an apology. A fact, delivered with the specific weight of a man who found facts more useful than apologies." "She's not wrong about the writ," Cortana said. "I've accessed the Imperial legal architecture. Her authority is genuine. John, they will attempt to remove me from your systems. That's the first step. After that, a pause. I don't know what happens after that. To you, the precedent for entities of unknown origin in Imperial records is not encouraging." John looked at the aftermath around him. At 60 word bearers, at the scorched remnant of a demonic summoning apparatus, at Dakios, standing at parade rest with the air of a soldier who has learned that the most dangerous moments often arrive after the fighting stops, at the Inquisitor, whose 30 seconds of courtesy were running out. He made a choice. Not his final choice. He understood, with the tactical clarity that had kept him alive across 30 years of impossible situations, that this was not the moment for final choices, and this was the moment for the choice that kept all future choices available. "I'll submit to interview," he said. "Voluntarily, no restraints, no removal of the AI." He held Voss's ash-colored eyes. "Non-negotiable on that last point." Voss studied him for a moment that stretched. "Everything," she said quietly, "is negotiable in the Imperium of Man, Master Chief. That is both its greatest strength and its fundamental disease." She looked at Guilliman. "The Primarch's courtesy has been extended. Mine begins now." Back to John. "You have 1 hour to prepare a full account of your origin, your capabilities, and the nature of the artificial intelligence in your systems. After that, we begin formally." A slight pause. "I should tell you, I've reviewed the combat recorder data from this engagement." "And," John said. "And," Voss said, with the specific quality of someone recalibrating a model against unexpected data, "you are either the most dangerous thing I've investigated this decade, or the most useful." She turned to leave. "In my experience, those categories overlap considerably." She walked out through the hole Guilliman had made in the wall, her retinue falling in behind her with the practiced ease of people who followed someone who never looked back. John looked at Guilliman. "Friend of yours?" he asked. "The Inquisition," Guilliman said, "with 10,000 years of complicated history compressed into 4 words, is no one's friend." Calax Primus smelled like burning mathematics. That was the only way Cortana could describe it when John asked for an atmospheric analysis 40 seconds after their insertion craft touched down in the decommissioned ore processing channel. A smell that wasn't chemical but conceptual. The specific olfactory signature of a place where the laws governing cause and effect had been under sustained assault for 11 weeks and were beginning to show the strain. The Iron Warriors hadn't just besieged a forge world. They had methodically, professionally, with the patience of beings who measured time in centuries rather than years, begun the process of rewriting what Calax Primus meant, turning it from a place that made things into a place that unmade them. They were very good at it. John had been on the ground for 90 seconds and already had a profound professional respect for his enemy. The ore channel was 3 meters wide and 4 deep, a ferrocrete trench running 400 meters through the heart of the besieged manufacturing district. Decommissioned when the ore deposits it served had been exhausted 3 centuries prior, and since used for cable routing and maintenance access. The Iron Warriors hadn't fortified it because it didn't appear on any standard tactical assessment of viable approach vectors. It appeared on theirs because Cortana had found it in the Forge World's original construction schematics, cross-referenced against Iron Warrior's siege doctrine, and identified it as the precise category of terrain that 10,000 years of successful warfare makes you stop looking at. 2 minutes to coordinated entry, Cortana said. She was running at full capacity through a dedicated Vox relay Guilliman had quietly authorized. Not an announcement, not a formal concession, just a piece of communications hardware that appeared in John's kit with a Mechanicus blessing seal still warm from the incense. The Primarch's version of saying yes without creating a record of having said yes. Dakios confirms entry on Corridor 2. Praxian and Vael confirm Corridor 3. All units nominal. John moved through the ore channel with Boro and an ultramarine tech marine called Sextus, chosen for his ability to interface with Mechanicus artillery control systems and his demonstrated quality of not asking questions that would slow things down. Boro had not spoken since the Forge Hall. John had stopped expecting him to. Their communication had evolved into a functional shorthand of gesture and positioning that worked precisely because it made no assumptions about shared doctrine. Look above them, muffled by ferrocrete and distance. The conventional assault had begun. He could feel it more than hear it. The ground percussion of Guilliman's main force hitting the fortified approaches at minute 0. The sustained thunder of return fire from Iron Warrior's siege artillery that had been softening those approaches for 11 weeks. Thousands of people doing something extremely dangerous to provide cover for 6 people doing something slightly more dangerous in the quiet below. 90 seconds, Cortana said. Iron Warrior's defensive response is consistent with doctrine. They're concentrating on the main assault. No indication of awareness of the corridor units. A pause. John, I'm reading something anomalous in the artillery control section. Power signature inconsistent with standard siege artillery management systems. Define anomalous, he said quietly. A second intelligence, she said. Not AI, not like me. Something warp-based. A demon bound into the artillery control architecture. It's managing targeting solutions, ammunition allocation, firing sequences. The Iron Warriors didn't just fortify this position. They installed a thinking demon as their fire control computer. John processed this. Can you interface with it? Absolutely not, Cortana said, with a precision that made clear this was not reluctance, but categorical impossibility. It exists partially outside physical reality. I can interface with the hardware it's running through, but the demon itself would... John, it would be like trying to have a conversation with a hurricane. Except the hurricane is malicious and interested in consuming me specifically. So, we destroy the hardware. Destroying the hardware expels the daemon back into the warp, but also triggers an emergency firing sequence. Everything the artillery has left, all at once, directed at the main assault force. A pause, weighted with calculation. Unless the hardware is destroyed in a specific sequence. The demon's binding architecture has a hierarchy. The primary binding node, destroyed first, forces it to use remaining processing capacity to maintain coherence rather than initiate emergency protocols. Then the secondary systems can be disabled cleanly. Where's the primary binding node? Physically? Inside the main control chamber. Spiritually? Another pause. John, it's in the room's central altar. They built an altar to house the binding. It will be warded, consecrated to chaos, and actively hostile to anything that approaches it with intent to destroy it. Is it hostile to things that approach it with intent to do something else? A brief silence. That's an interesting question. Work on it, he said. 30 seconds. The artillery control section resolved at the end of the ore channel as a reinforced blast door. 8 centimeters of hardened steel with a locking mechanism that Sextus examined for approximately 4 seconds before producing a tool from his armor storage that John didn't recognize and applying it with the confidence of someone who had broken into chaos-held facilities before and found the experience professionally educational. The door opened. They went through. The control chamber was vast and wrong in the specific way that chaos architecture was wrong. Not random, not chaotic in the colloquial sense, but ordered according to a different set of priorities than human survival and comfort. Every surface was covered in Iron Warriors iconography, corrupted beyond recognition. The original imperial eagles and fists motifs still visible underneath the new scripture, like bruises beneath skin. Banks of cogitator equipment lined the walls, each one integrated with ritual components. Candles that burned without wax, chains that held nothing, screens displaying targeting solutions in numerals that shifted when looked at directly. At the center, on a raised dais, the altar. It was built from artillery components, shell casings, targeting systems, or range-finding equipment, all integrated into a structure approximately 2 meters tall that pulsed with energy John's visor read as partially thermal and partially something without a frequency. Chained to it, in a manner that suggested the chaining served both physical and metaphysical functions, was a being that his threat assessment processed and declined to fully classify. It was aware of them the moment they entered. It had been aware of them, John suspected, for longer than that. Primary binding node is the central mechanism, Cortana said quietly. The altar's top component. Destroy that first, then I can take the cogitator systems offline in sequence. A pause. John, it's going to try to stop you, not through the Iron Warriors, directly. How directly? It's a bound demon. It can't fully manifest without breaking the binding, which would destroy its control of the artillery. It will use what it has available. Another pause. The artillery systems themselves. It can direct them inward. The ferrocrete above us is 2 meters thick, but the bore diameter of the guns. Enough detail, he said. Boro, secondary systems, north wall. Sextus, cogitators, east bank, await my signal. I'm taking the altar. He crossed the chamber at a pace that was neither rushing nor walking. The specific controlled tempo of someone moving towards something dangerous with enough awareness of the danger to respect it and enough training to not let that respect become hesitation. The demon's awareness tracked him like a physical pressure. The temperature dropped 17 degrees in the time it took him to cover 30 meters. The altar's pulse shifted frequency, faster, then irregular, then a pattern that Cortana flagged as communicative rather than mechanical. It was talking, not to John, past him through the walls. "It's signaling," Cortana said sharply. "Not emergency firing sequence. It's calling, broadcasting a warp frequency signal. A beat. John, the word-bearer's ritual, the unbroken shield. It recognized you. It's telling them where you are." He broke into a run. The demon responded. The cogitator banks along the north wall discharged simultaneously. Not artillery, but the raw energy of 11 weeks of accumulated targeting calculations released as an uncontrolled pulse that blew Boro sideways into the far wall with enough force to crack ceramite. The floor between John and the altar buckled upward as underground mechanisms responded to commands that weren't authorized by any human operator. He went over the buckled floor rather than through it. 3 strides on the angled surface, using the incline as acceleration, in Mjolnir's servos compensating for the angle in real time. The demon's awareness spiked. He felt it as a pressure behind his eyes, a sound below hearing, the specific sensation of being looked at by something that understood him in ways he hadn't consented to being understood. He hit the altar with everything he had, not a weapon. His hands, gauntleted fists driving into the primary binding node with the full hydraulic force of Mjolnir's servo-assisted strength, which was enough to overturn a Scorpion tank and was currently focused into approximately 40 square centimeters of chaos-consecrated artillery components. The node shattered. The altar screamed in a frequency that existed below sound. The demon's coherence fractured. John felt it as a sudden pressure release, like atmosphere venting, the specific sensation of something very large suddenly not being present. "Primary node destroyed," Cortana said, and her voice was tight with controlled urgency. "Taking secondary systems offline. Now. Now. Now." The cogitator banks died in sequence, east to west, north to south, Sextus moving through them with practiced efficiency, while Cortana directed the shutdown sequence through the Vox relay with a precision that made the process look choreographed. The artillery above them went silent, one battery at a time. The sustained thunder of the main assault's opposition dropping away section by section like lights going out across a city. From outside, transmitted through Guilliman's Vox relay, John heard the Primarch's voice, not shouting, not triumphant, simply recalibrating in real time with the equanimity of a man who had planned for success and was now executing it. All units advance. Artillery suppression confirmed. Push to the inner fortification. 12 minutes. 4 seconds. Boro pulled himself out of the wall, examined the cracked ceramite on his left pauldron, looked at John. "Good," Boro said. It was the longest single utterance John had heard from him. He filed it accordingly. "Dakios confirms Corridor 2 objective complete," Cortana reported. "Praxian confirms Corridor 3. All 3 artillery control sections offline." A slight pause. The pause that meant she was processing something that required a different register. "John, The signal the demon sent before the node was destroyed. I tracked the destination. Where did it go? 11 systems, she said. The same 11 systems Voss mentioned. The word-bearer's ritual network. The pause extended. They all received the signal simultaneously. They all know where you are now. A beat. And John, 11 systems means 11 separate warbands. The ritual wasn't just about finding you. It was about converging on you once you were found. Above them, I threw 2 meters of ferrocrete. The sound of the Imperial advance rolled forward like a tide, finding its true level. The deep percussion of Space Marine boots on Forge World ferrocrete. The crack of bolters. The sustained roar of something very large moving very fast in the direction of an enemy that had just lost its primary tactical advantage. John stood in the ruined control chamber with Cortana's assessment hanging in the neural link between them. And he did what he always did when the tactical picture expanded into something larger and more complicated than the immediate mission. He updated the model. The siege of Calix Primus ended in 6 hours and 43 minutes. Military historians, the ones permitted to record such things, which in the Imperium meant historians specifically authorized by the Administratum, cross-referenced by the Inquisition, and approved by a magister, whose title alone took 4 lines to write, would later describe it as a textbook combined arms operation executed with unusual tactical flexibility. They would note the simultaneous corridor insertions, the artillery suppression sequence, the subsequent collapse of the Iron Warriors' defensive cohesion once their fire control was eliminated. They would attribute the operation's success to Lord Commander Guilliman's characteristic strategic brilliance and leave a polite, institutional silence where the details didn't fit the framework. The framework had no category for John 117. He stood on the Forge World's primary landing platform as the cleanup operations continued below. Ultramarines moving through the recaptured manufacturing districts in methodical clearance patterns. Its Skitari emerging from fortified positions where they'd held for 11 weeks with the specific quality of people who had been certain they were going to die and were still calibrating to the fact that they hadn't. Medicae shuttles moved in steady patterns. The sky over Calax Primus was the burnt orange of a world that processed ore for a living, and it was the most normal sky John had seen since arriving in the 41st millennium. Guilliman found him there. He came alone again. The deliberate choice, the statement made through absence of entourage. He stood beside John and looked at the Forge world spread below them and was quiet for a moment in the way that people are quiet when they're deciding how to begin something that doesn't have a clean beginning. "The signal," Guilliman said. "Cortana briefed me." 11 warbands, John said. "Converging." "Yes." Guilliman was quiet again. "The Inquisition's assessment is that the convergence timeline, given warp travel unpredictability, is somewhere between 3 weeks and 4 months. Voss is coordinating intercept operations." He paused. "She also filed a formal report reclassifying your status from unsanctioned entity to provisional Imperial asset, with Cortana designated as a unique intelligence of significant military value rather than heretical technology." A slight pause. "The wording took her 6 hours. She told me she rewrote it 4 times. She struck me as someone who chooses words carefully, John said. She is, which is why the final designation means something. Guilliman looked at him steadily. It means you're not a prisoner, not a weapon to be aimed, not a tool to be filed under a classification that makes imperial bureaucracy comfortable. Another pause. It means you have standing in this Imperium, such as it is. John looked at the orange sky, at the Medici shuttles moving in their steady patterns, at the Skitari emerging from their fortifications into a forge world that was still theirs, that was still functional, that still made things instead of unmaking them. The 11 warbands aren't the real problem, he said. No, Guilliman agreed. The real problem is what they represent. The word bearers don't mobilize 11 warbands for a single target without theological justification. They believe you're something specific. He paused. The unbroken shield, an entity immune to chaos corruption by origin. In their theology, that makes you either a weapon to be captured and corrupted, proof that their gods can corrupt anything, or an existential argument against their faith that must be eliminated. So they'll keep coming. Until they're stopped, or until you're gone, Guilliman said. Yes. John was quiet for a moment. Gone means home. Gone means home, Guilliman confirmed. Which brings me to the second thing I wanted to discuss. He produced a data slate, not Voss's spare, precise model, but something older, thicker, covered in annotations in that same handwriting John had seen in the Codex Astartes. The Mechanicus, specifically Magos Kal, who filed 14 pages of technical assessment about your armor, your neural interface, and your AI integration architecture, and then at the end, as though it was a footnote, included his theoretical framework for reconstructing a crystal matrix slipspace corridor using a combination of warp resonance technology and standard Imperial Geller field mechanics. John looked at the data slate. He thinks he can send me home. He thinks it's theoretically possible, Guilliman said carefully. The distinction matters. Ka'al is extraordinary, even by Mechanicus standards, but the engineering challenge is significant. Months of work, minimum, possibly longer. He paused. During which time 11 Chaos warbands are converging on your location. And the Imperium gets a provisional asset, John said. And the Imperium gets a provisional asset, Guilliman agreed, with the honesty of a man who had decided, somewhere in the past 72 hours, that John 117 deserved the unvarnished version of things. I want to be clear. I am not asking you to stay. I am not manufacturing a reason to retain you. If Ka'al's framework is viable and you want to go home, the Mechanicus will work on it with full resources, and you will go home. He looked at John directly. I am telling you what the situation is and letting you choose. Because that is what you deserve, and also because... A slight pause. Because I've spent 10,000 years surrounded by people who follow orders, and I find the company of someone who makes choices to be restorative. John, Cortana said softly, whatever you decide, I want you to know that. He looked at the forge world below, at the work being done, the slow, costly, imperfect work of holding something together against everything that wanted to pull it apart. He thought about the UNSC, about Earth, about a war that had nearly ended humanity 3 times and hadn't, because people who were very tired kept making the choice to continue. He thought about 11 Chaos warbands and a Mechanicus Adept with 14 pages of technical assessment and a theoretical framework that might, eventually, be a door home. He thought about Guilliman writing a book 10,000 years ago and standing here now, updating it. "I'll stay," he said, "until Kaal has something workable, until the convergence is dealt with." He paused. "And I have conditions." "Of course you do," Guilliman said. There was something in his voice that was not quite amusement, and was probably the closest the Primarch's architecture allowed for it. "State them." Cortana operates without restriction. No assessment period, no inquisitorial monitoring of her systems. Voss gets her report, she doesn't get access. He looked at Guilliman. "My unit, Dakios, and the Forge Hall team stays assigned to me. I won't operate with people I haven't worked with." A pause. "And I want full tactical authority on operations I lead. Consultation with you, coordination with your staff, but no doctrine override mid-operation." Guilliman was quiet for a moment. "The third condition will cause problems with my officers." "Your officers can file a commendation and a formal objection simultaneously," John said. "I've seen it done." Something happened in Guilliman's expression. The geological quality of it shifted. Not broke, not cracked, but shifted. The way a landscape shifts when something very slow has been moving underneath it for a very long time and has finally arrived somewhere. He extended his hand. Not a Primarch offering benediction, a commander offering agreement. John took it. The handshake lasted precisely as long as handshakes between professionals last. Long enough to mean something, short enough to get back to work. "The 11 warbands," Guilliman said. Releasing John's hand and turning back to the display, Cortana had already begun populating with convergence trajectories. "Where do we start?" "Closest warband is 4 weeks out," Cortana said, through the Vox relay, her voice crisp and clear and entirely herself. "Iron Warriors, different warband from Kallax, but same siege specialization. They're moving through the Karis sector toward a staging world called Mendak's Reach." "I know Mendak's Reach," Guilliman said. He studied the trajectories with the focused attention of a 10,000-year-old mind, finding what it was built to find. "The terrain favors a defender with unconventional tactical approach." John looked at the display, at the trajectories, at the scope of what was converging and what it would take to meet it. He thought about 63% odds in a manufactorum, about a demon bound in artillery components, and about a sergeant who communicated in corrections and single syllables and had called him something that required 2 centuries of context to fully appreciate. He thought about a book written 10,000 years ago by a man who was standing next to him right now, updating it in real time. "Show me Mendak's Reach," he said. The 41st millennium had swallowed greater things than a single soldier from a distant future. It had consumed heroes by the billions, saints by the thousands, and demigods by the score. It had taken everything humanity produced at its finest and fed it into a war without end, without resolution, without the comfort of an arc that bent toward justice. The grim-dark future did not care about the quality of what it destroyed. It simply destroyed. John 117 was not destroyed. He remained on Calax Primus for 3 more days, while Magos Kaal began the theoretical groundwork for a slipspace reconstruction. 14 pages becoming 40, becoming 100, becoming a project that would occupy one of the Mechanicus's finest minds for the foreseeable future. He ran tactical assessments with Cortana through the nights and briefed Guilliman through the mornings. Dakios filed no more formal notations about non-Astartes leadership. Boro spoke 11 words over the 3 days, which John tracked because they were all useful. Inquisitor Voss departed with her retinue and a data slate containing the most unusual intelligence report in the Ordo Xenos' recent history. She did not say goodbye. She sent a single Vox message that contained 3 words. Don't get corrupted. John sent back 2. You either. What John 117 represented to the Imperium of man was not a savior, not a messiah, not another golden figure to be placed on an altar and worshipped until the original meaning was gone. He was something rarer and more dangerous than any of those things. He was proof that humanity, given different circumstances, could produce something that thought rather than merely believed. That fought with choice rather than doctrine. That carried an AI not as a heresy, but as a partnership. The 11 warbands were converging. The galaxy was burning as it always burned. Somewhere in the dark between stars, a Spartan and a Primarch were planning something the Iron Warriors had never seen in any version of any doctrine. The Emperor protects, but sometimes protection arrives from somewhere the Emperor never anticipated. The Emperor protects. More stories await.